I mean, I think he's top 20 greatest players to play.
You think Karl Malone is?
Yeah.
But what about his off the court stuff? You know, does that factor in at all?
No, I really don't know a lot of off the court stuff about Karl Malone.
He got a 13-year-old pregnant. I'm going to go Oscar Robertson and Julius Erving.
Karl Malone's story is not just about basketball anymore. That is the main point. For years, people talked about his scoring, his power, his long career, and all the records he set in the NBA. They talked about the way he played with John Stockton, the way the Utah Jazz built their whole system around that partnership, and the way Malone became one of the biggest names the league had ever seen. But today, when people hear the name Karl Malone, many of them are not thinking first about points, trophies, or all-star games. They're thinking about the parts of his story that never fully went away. They're thinking about the things that stayed in the background for years, the things many people feel were pushed aside, ignored, or kept quiet for too long. That is why this story still follows him. That is why, even after all these years, the conversation around Karl Malone feels unfinished. On the court, Karl Malone built a career that almost no player in league history could match. He was strong, durable, and always available. Night after night, season after season, he kept putting up numbers that made him look almost machine-like. He won 2 MVP awards. He made 14 All-Star teams. He earned 11 straight All-NBA first-team selections. He finished with over 36,000 career points, which once placed him second on the all-time list. For nearly 2 decades, he gave the Utah Jazz a steady force they could trust. He ran the floor, finished through contact, hit tough shots, and punished defenders in the post. He was not just great for a few years, he stayed great for a very long time, and that kind of long-term greatness is rare in any era. His partnership with John Stockton became one of the most famous duos basketball has ever seen. Their pick and roll was simple, but almost impossible to stop. Coaches studied it, young players tried to copy it, defenses knew it was coming and still struggled to shut it down. That duo turned Utah into a team that mattered every single year. In a league filled with giant markets and bright lights, the Jazz became a real threat because Malone and Stockton gave them a clear identity. They were tough, organized, and hard to break. Even fans who did not love the Jazz had to respect what that pair built together. Their teamwork became a symbol of consistency, and Malone was right at the center of it. And yet, for all that greatness, there was always one thing missing. Karl Malone never won an NBA championship. He came close, very close. In 1997 and 1998, the Jazz reached the NBA Finals, and in both years they ran into Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. That became one of the most painful parts of Malone's basketball legacy. He had the stats, the awards, and the respect, but not the ring. In 1997, he won MVP and led Utah to a great regular season, only to lose in the finals. In that same series came one of the most famous lines in NBA history when Scottie Pippen told him, "The mailman doesn't deliver on Sundays," right before Malone missed 2 huge free throws. That moment stuck to him. Fair or not, it became part of the way people talked about him. Not just as a great player, but as a great player who fell short in the biggest moments. The same thing happened again in 1998. Utah got back to the finals. Malone battled. The Jazz fought. But once again, Jordan and the Bulls stood in the way. Jordan's final shot in Game 6 became one of the most replayed moments in sports history, and Malone was on the wrong side of it. That is part of what made his story feel so dramatic. He was one of the best players ever, but the biggest prize always stayed just out of reach.
In 2003, late in his career, he joined the Los Angeles Lakers to chase one last shot at a title. On paper, that team looked like it had everything. Malone, Kobe Bryant, Shaquille O'Neal, and Gary Payton, all on one roster, sounded like a sure thing. But injuries, tension, and bad timing got in the way. The Lakers lost in the finals to Detroit, and Malone retired in 2004 without the championship he had spent so long chasing. If the story ended there, Karl Malone would be remembered in a much simpler way. He would be remembered as one of the greatest power forwards ever, one of the toughest players ever, and one of the best stars to never win a ring. But that is not where the story ends. The reason people still argue so hard about Karl Malone is because of what happened away from basketball. Those parts of his life stayed in the shadows for years, but they never fully disappeared. And when the internet became stronger, faster, and harder to control, those old stories came back in a way they never had before. The most serious and most discussed part of that history goes back to the early 1980s. According to widely reported accounts, Malone fathered a child with Gloria Bell when she was 13 and he was 20 years old. That child, Demetris Bell, was born in 1984. No criminal charges were filed in that case, and for years, the full public discussion around it remained limited. But the facts that became public later shocked many people who had never heard the story before. For a long time, many fans knew Karl Malone only as a Hall of Fame player. They did not know the details of this part of his past, and when they finally did learn about it, a lot of them looked back at his public honors and wondered how this was not a bigger part of the way he had been remembered. What made the story even more troubling to many people was not only the age gap, but the way the situation seemed to be handled afterward. A paternity suit was filed, and Malone was later confirmed as the father. Reports over the years said there was a settlement, child support issues, and a long period where he was not truly present in Demetris Bell's life. That is where the public anger grew. It was not just about a terrible story from the past, it was also about the silence that followed. It was about the feeling that fame, money, and basketball greatness helped keep one of the darkest parts of his history from becoming central to his public image. For many people, that silence became part of the problem. There was also another paternity case that added to the picture. Before he was an NBA star, Malone fathered twins, Cheryl and Darryl Ford, when both he and the mother were teenagers. That case is different from the Gloria Bell story because the ages were not the same kind of issue, but it still fed a larger pattern that critics noticed. Again, there were legal fights, reports of denied responsibility, and years of distance before family ties were built. Over time, some of those family relationships improved. That matters, and it should be said. But for critics, the larger concern remained the same. They saw a pattern of absence, avoidance, and late response. And once that pattern became public, it became harder to separate it from the basketball legend image. Then there was the 2003 Lakers incident involving Vanessa Bryant, Kobe Bryant's wife. That story added another layer to how people viewed Malone. According to reports from that time, Malone made remarks that Vanessa Bryant found inappropriate, and Kobe Bryant confronted him over it. Malone's side later suggested the comments were misunderstood or made in jest, but the damage was done.
Trust inside that Lakers team was already weak, and this made things worse. Again, no formal legal action came from that situation, but it fed the idea that controversies around Malone followed a very similar path. There would be a bad moment, then denial or soft explanation, then silence, and then time would pass. That pattern is what many critics focus on more than anything else. Not just one event, not just one accusation, not just one report. A pattern. A pattern where serious issues appeared, were pushed away, privately handled or publicly minimized, and then allowed to fade while Malone's basketball reputation stayed strong. That is what made the backlash stronger in recent years. The internet did not invent these stories. What it did was make them harder to hide. Information that once stayed buried in old reports, court details, or local coverage could now spread everywhere in a matter of hours. Younger fans who grew up only hearing about Malone's on-court greatness suddenly found out there was much more to the story. That is why the 2023 NBA All-Star Weekend in Salt Lake City became such a big moment. On the surface, it was supposed to be a celebration. Utah was hosting. Malone was one of the biggest legends in franchise history. He appeared at events, took part in ceremonies, and stood again in the middle of the basketball world. But in the modern media age, that kind of public return does not happen in a clean, simple way. The second Karl Malone stepped back into a spotlight that large, the old questions came with him. People online started talking again. Old stories resurfaced. Articles were shared. Clips spread. And when Malone was asked directly about the backlash, his answer only made the discussion louder. His response was blunt. He basically said he did not care and that it was his personal life. That answer hit people in very different ways. Some felt he had the right to refuse a public discussion in that setting. Others felt that after so many years of silence, that response sounded cold and dismissive. That was the problem. The issue was not only what he said, it was what people felt the answer revealed. To many critics, it sounded like the same posture they believed had existed for decades. Avoid, shut it down, move on, let time do the rest. But by 2023, time was no longer doing the job it once did. The internet kept replaying the moment, and the refusal to engage became part of the story itself. At the same time, Malone was being honored. He was visible during one of the NBA's happiest weekends. He was treated like a legend because as a basketball player, that is exactly what he is. And that created a huge tension. On one side, you had the league celebrating a former star. On the other side, you had fans and critics saying that this celebration ignored serious parts of his history. That tension is really the heart of the Karl Malone debate. It is not only about whether he was a great player. That part is obvious. It is about whether sports greatness should allow people to move past things that would define the public memory of almost anyone else. The debate grew even stronger when Louisiana Tech unveiled a statue of Malone. For supporters, the statue honored his basketball journey, his success, and his connection to the school. For critics, the statue was a symbol of something much more troubling. They felt it showed how easily institutions will celebrate athletic greatness while pushing painful truths aside. That is why the statue sparked real anger. It was not just a piece of bronze, it became a message, and many people asked what that message meant to students, to families, and to anyone who knew the darker parts of Malone's story. When a person with that kind of history is celebrated in such a public and permanent way, people are going to ask what exactly is being honored. What made the whole thing even more complicated was that Malone did not always stay completely silent in every setting. In a quieter interview, away from the public pressure of an event like All-Star Weekend, he spoke in a different tone. He talked about flaws. He suggested that his flaws might be worse than those of many other people. He spoke in a way that sounded more reflective, more personal, and more aware than the cold brush-off people had seen in front of cameras. And for many watchers, that made the story even more frustrating.
Because it suggested that somewhere inside, he does understand the weight of what follows him. He may understand far more than he is willing to say in public. That difference matters. It matters because people are not only listening for words, they are looking for honesty. They're looking for clear ownership. They're looking for something that feels real. And in Malone's case, the criticism has often been that whenever the conversation gets close to a direct public reckoning, he pulls away. He becomes guarded. He becomes distant. He shuts the door. So when he sounds more open in a private or calm setting, some people see a man trying to face himself. Others see someone who knows how to speak in a softer tone without ever fully saying what needs to be said. That is why even his more thoughtful comments have not ended the criticism. Part of Malone's later self-reflection has touched on his own childhood. He has spoken about growing up poor in Louisiana, working hard from a young age, and living without a father figure after his father died when Malone was still young. That background does not erase anything, it does not excuse anything, but it may help explain some of the emotional distance that shaped the man he became. Some listeners hear those parts of his story and think about pain being passed down from one generation to the next.
They think about a boy who grew up without guidance and later failed in serious ways as a father himself. But even if that explains something, it does not settle anything. Explanation is not the same as accountability. Understanding a wound does not remove the damage done to others. That is why Karl Malone's legacy feels so split in two. One side is the basketball side, and it is almost untouchable. He is one of the greatest ever. The numbers prove it. The tape proves it. The awards prove it. Coaches still study what he and Stockton did together. His body of work on the court is real, lasting, and historic. But the other side is just as real. The reported relationship with a 13-year-old girl, the paternity fights, the long silence, the family absences, the 2003 controversy, the public brush-offs. Those things are also part of the record now, and they are not going away. That is what makes his story so hard to place in one simple box. Some people argue that the healing inside his family should count for something. Demetris Bell eventually had a relationship with Malone. Cheryl Ford became a successful athlete in her own right, and over time, the family picture became less broken than it once was. Those are important facts, and it would be wrong to ignore them. Human lives are not frozen in one moment forever. People can repair things. Families can rebuild. Children can choose their own path toward forgiveness or peace. That matters. But critics say those later relationships do not erase the earlier harm. They do not erase the silence, the delay, or the power imbalance at the center of the most serious allegations. Both of those things can be true at once. Some healing can happen, and the original damage can still remain deeply disturbing. And this is where the phrase life sentence starts to make more sense, not as a legal sentence, not as a prison term, but as a lifelong shadow. That is what many people mean when they use words like that around Karl Malone. They mean that some actions do not stay in the past just because time moves on. They stay attached to a person's name. They come back at award shows, at statue unveilings, at Hall of Fame talks, at reunion weekends, and every time history tries to celebrate the athlete without mentioning the rest. It becomes a sentence carried in public memory, not something ordered by a judge, but something attached by history. That is what makes the Karl Malone story bigger than one man. It becomes a question about sports itself. What do fans do with legends whose personal lives are filled with pain, harm, or serious moral questions? What do teams do? What do schools do? What does a league do when a player's greatness on the court is real, but so is the damage tied to his name? Sports history loves simple stories. It loves heroes, numbers, trophies, and big moments. But real life is not simple. Some careers cannot be told honestly without discomfort. Some names force people to sit in that discomfort, whether they want to or not. The NBA has faced versions of this problem before, and it will face them again. The issue is not only Karl Malone.
The deeper issue is how institutions handle greatness when greatness comes with baggage that is too heavy to ignore. For decades, sports often chose the easy path. They honored the athlete, stayed quiet about the rest, and let the public decide how much it wanted to remember. But in the modern era, that strategy works less and less. Fans dig, old stories return, social media keeps hard questions alive, and silence now often feels louder than words. That is why Malone's name keeps coming back into the conversation. Not because people are bored, not because the internet made up a scandal, but because the full story was never dealt with in a way that felt complete. And maybe that is the central truth here. The reason Karl Malone remains such a powerful and uncomfortable figure is not simply because of what happened. It is because the story feels unresolved. His career got the full spotlight. His records were celebrated. His honors were protected. But the moral questions around him never received that same level of public reckoning. So every new ceremony, every new tribute, every new appearance reopens the same argument. People are not only reacting to the past, they are reacting to the feeling that the past was never truly faced.
That is also why his own words matter so much. When he says that he has flaws, people listen. When he says he falls short, people notice. When he sounds more aware in private than in public, people pick up on it. Because buried inside those moments is the possibility of something he has never fully given the public. A clear, direct, unmistakable confrontation with his own history. Not a brush-off, not a short answer, not a vague comment about flaws. Something plain, something honest, something that does not hide behind time, privacy, or distance. Whether that ever happens is still unknown, and until it does, many people will feel that the story remains unfinished. What history does with Karl Malone may never be settled in a clean way. Some people will always start with the basketball and stay there. They will talk about 36,000 points, about MVP trophies, about power, toughness, and long years of greatness. Others will hear his name and think first about Gloria Bell, about Demetris Bell, about the reports, the silence, the family pain, and the way institutions kept honoring him anyway. That split may never fully close. Maybe it cannot. Maybe the most honest way to tell the Karl Malone story is to refuse to simplify it. He was one of the best basketball players ever. That is true. He was part of one of the greatest duos the game has ever seen. That is true. He built a Hall of Fame career without ever winning the ring he wanted most. That is true. And the off-court record that follows him, the controversies, the reported harm, the questions of accountability, and the long public silence around all of it, those things are true parts of his story too. History does not get to keep one half and throw away the other. Once both sides are known, both sides stay. So when people ask why Karl Malone is still such a debated figure after all these years, the answer is simple. Because the numbers never erased the pain. Because the trophies never closed the questions. Because the honors never answered the criticism. Because time did not bury the story the way many powerful people probably hoped it would. Instead, time gave the public more distance, more access, and a clearer view of what had been left out. And once that happened, the clean version of the legend was gone for good. In the end, Karl Malone's real legacy may be this uneasy mix of greatness and silence. A man who delivered excellence on the court for nearly 20 years, but whose name now carries far more than rebounds, points, and awards. A man who reached the top of the sport, but never escaped the weight of the life he lived outside it. A man who may understand his own flaws more deeply than he has ever said out loud, but who still has not given the kind of public clarity many people believe is long overdue. That is why the conversation never really ends. The records are still there, the highlights are still there, the Hall of Fame speech is still there. But so are the old reports, the settlements, the family stories, the criticism and the anger that returns every time he is celebrated like none of it matters. That is why this story remains alive, not because people refuse to move on for no reason, but because some stories do not move on until they are truly faced. And when it comes to Karl Malone, many people believe that day has still not come.